Pilot threatens black CEO with federal arrest. Bodycam reveals shocks entire flight. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's get back to the story. Ma'am, you've been flagged by federal security. I need you to stand up and step into the aisle. The voice wasn't shouted. It carried. Conversations inside the first-class cabin thinned into silence. The overhead bins were already closed. The aircraft door still open. Pre-departure air hummed through the vents like a low warning. Captain Daniel Reeves stood just outside the cockpit, posture, rigid silver hair, perfectly combed beneath recessed cabin lighting. 4 gold stripes lined his sleeve. Authority stitched and polished. Behind him stood a Federal Air Marshal, broad-shouldered expression unreadable. One hand rested near the restraint pouch clipped to his belt. Not raised. Not yet dead. Seated in 2A, the woman looked up slowly. She wore a structured ivory blazer. Minimal jewelry. No visible designer logos. Her posture was composed, shoulder-squared hands resting calmly against the armrests. A black lanyard hung around her neck. The ID badge attached to it tapped lightly against her blazer as she shifted. Captain Reeves continued. TSA Secure Flight flagged a manifest discrepancy linked to your credential access. We need to verify your identity off-camera before departure. Off-camera. The Air Marshal's Bodycam lens blinked red. Recording. Across the aisle, a blonde woman in a red dress and cropped fur jacket crossed her arms, tighter lips pursed. I said something didn't add up, she murmured. A man, 2 rows back, raised his phone. The woman in 2A did not move. Am I being detained? She asked evenly. The question wasn't emotional. It was procedural. The Air Marshal stepped forward half a pace. Ma'am, at this time, you are not under arrest. But you are being asked to comply with a federal security review under 49U. S.C. 44,902. Failure to comply may result in removal from the aircraft. The cabin absorbed that. Removal. The captain's jaw tightened. We cannot depart until this is resolved. Outside the window, baggage handlers paused near the cargo hold. The jet bridge remained connected. Inside, something else had connected. Pattern recognition. 21 years earlier, she had stood in another aisle while a gate supervisor said you don't match the reservation profile. Different airport.
Same tone.
She didn't stand then either. Today, she remained seated. On what basis, she asked calmly, does my identity trigger a federal review? The captain glanced toward the lanyard. Toward the badge. But he didn't read it. He had already accepted the alert. The Air Marshal's voice remained neutral. Your name appears in an executive clearance registry tied to this aircraft. That access level does not match your boarding classification. A ripple of confusion moved through the cabin. Executive clearance. The blonde woman blinked. The woman in 2 finally reached up not toward the marshal but toward the badge resting against her chest. Her thumb brushed the plastic casing. The clearance line printed beneath her name was small, but unmistakable. She looked directly at the blinking Bodycam lens, then back at the captain. You're delaying departure, she said quietly, based on an access level you don't understand. A pause. Measured. Controlled. Before you escalate this to removal, she added, I strongly suggest you verify who holds that registry. The Air Marshal didn't lower his stance. But he did hesitate, and for the first time the cabin wasn't watching her. It was watching them. The cabin didn't breathe again. It recalculated. The words executive clearance registry lingered in the air longer than the accusation had. Captain Reeves glanced toward the flight tablet mounted beside the cockpit door. The manifest screen still glowed with a yellow security banner. FLAG executive access mismatch level 7 clearance detected. Level 7. Not a frequent flyer tier. Not a loyalty perk. Operational. The Air Marshal shifted slightly, lowering his voice. Ma'am, executive registry access is typically restricted to corporate operations or aircraft ownership oversight. Your boarding pass reflects standard first-class seating. The implication hung unfinished. The blonde woman leaned forward from across the aisle. So she hacked it, she said sharply. That's what this is. A few passengers nodded reflexively. Others looked uneasy. The woman in two remained still. No, she replied calmly. That's not what this is. Her gaze moved briefly toward the captain's tablet. Level 7 clearance isn't self-assigned. It's issued by corporate aviation governance and tied to equity structure. A businessman across the aisle lowered his phone slightly. Equity structure, he repeated under his breath. The captain's jaw flexed. With respect, ma'am, that registry is not public-facing. And at present, it conflicts with your passenger classification. Conflict. Mismatch. Inconsistency. Words that had followed her most of her life. At 19, a campus security officer had said your access card doesn't align with your dorm assignment. It had. They just hadn't expected it to. Back in the present, she adjusted the cuff of her blazer. You're seeing a conflict because the system recognizes my authority on this aircraft, she said evenly, but your manifest only recognizes my seat. The Air Marshal's Bodycam continued to blink red, recording everything. A flight attendant near row 3 hesitated, then stepped closer. Captain, she said quietly, I remember a memo last quarter. Something about shareholder travel protocols. Dual classification access. The captain didn't look at her. That doesn't apply here. Sir, I'm not sure. The blonde woman scoffed again. This is ridiculous. We're all going to miss our connections because someone printed a fancy badge. That word again. Fancy. The woman in 2A finally turned her head toward her. It's not fancy, she said calmly. It's filed with the SEC. Silence. The Air Marshal's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Ma'am, he said carefully, are you stating you hold a controlling or partial ownership interest in this aircraft's operating entity? She met his eyes. I'm stating, she replied, that you are currently detaining a registered equity holder under a misinterpreted security flag. The captain's tablet chimed. A new notification pushed through the system. Corporate Ops Executive Registry ping confirmed. External verification pending. Pending. Ding. The word tightened the cabin again. The jet bridge was still attached. The doors were still open. But departure had already been delayed. And now, so had certainty. The notification didn't clear the tension. It multiplied it. External verification pending. Captain Reeves stared at the screen a second too long. Pending meant delay. Delay meant paperwork. Paperwork meant accountability. The Air Marshal spoke first. Captain under 49 you. Yes, see? 44,902B. The carrier has discretion to refuse transport if a passenger may be inimical to safety. He wasn't threatening. He was documenting. The bodycom blinked. The woman in 2 nodded slightly. Yes, she said calmly. And that discretion requires a reasonable safety determination, not an algorithmic inconsistency. A businessman across the aisle shifted. She hasn't raised her voice, he muttered. The blonde woman exhaled sharply. It's not about her voice. It's about security. The woman in 2A turned toward her again.
Security, she repeated evenly, is not suspicion.
The captain's jaw tightened. We cannot depart with unresolved executive-level clearance conflicts, he said. If necessary, you will be deplaned for identity verification. There it was. Deplaned, not arrested. Removed. The word moved through the cabin like a quiet verdict. A flight attendant near row 4 swallowed. Sir removal triggers mandatory incident documentation with corporate and FAA reporting. I'm aware, the captain said flatly. The woman in two leaned back slightly. So am I? Another chime from the captain's tablet. Corporate Aviation Compliance Registry Ownership Tier confirmed Level 7 active. The Air Marshal's eyes flicked to the screen. That's confirmation, he said. The captain didn't relax. It confirms the tier exists. It doesn't confirm her identity matches it. Fair. Procedural. Accurate. The woman in two slowly lifted the badge from her chest and held it between two fingers. The name printed beneath the clearance level was clear, but she didn't extend it yet. Instead, she asked one question. Captain Reeves, do you know who authorizes Level 7 registry access? He didn't answer. Because he did. Corporate governance. Board oversight. Equity review. Not operations. Not cockpit command. The Air Marshal shifted his weight. Ma'am, he said carefully, if you are asserting ownership interest in the operating entity, we will require secondary identification and confirmation from corporate headquarters before departure. She nodded once. That's reasonable. The cabin felt that shift. Reasonable. Not defiant. Not evasive. The blonde woman looked unsettled now. This is insane, she said. We're waiting because she says she owns something. The businessman across the aisle finally spoke louder. No, he said. We're waiting because they might be wrong. Silence followed that. The captain's tablet chimed again. This time the banner changed color. Yellow to amber. Priority call incoming corporate governance line. The Air Marshal glanced at the captain. You may want to take that. The jet bridge was still attached. The doors still open. But something had shifted. Authority was no longer unilateral. It was being reviewed. And the entire first-class cabin knew it. The tablet vibrated again. Not a notification. A call. Corporate governance priorities, secure line, the amber banner pulsed quietly. Captain Reeves hesitated for half a second, then stepped slightly aside toward the cockpit threshold and accepted it. Reeves. The cabin couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but they saw the shift in his posture. Yes, we have a registry mismatch tied to Level 7 clearance, yes. She's seated in two. No, she has not been restrained. A pause. Longer this time. The Air Marshal remained still, but his stance was no longer angled toward removal. It was angled toward assessment. The woman in two folded her hands calmly in her lap. She didn't watch the captain. She watched the Bodycam. Recording. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward. This is about ownership, isn't it? He whispered to the woman next to him. The blonde woman's confidence had thinned. This is just a glitch, she insisted quietly. It has to be. At the cockpit entrance, Captain Reeves' voice lowered. Yes, I understand governance structure. I was not informed of shareholder travel today. No, that detail was not included in dispatch notes. Another pause. His free hand dropped from the tablet. The authority in his shoulders softened just slightly. The Air Marshal stepped closer. Captain Reeves didn't answer immediately. He listened, then understood. Verifying now. The call ended. The cabin felt the silence like pressure change. Reeves turned slowly. His eyes no longer carried accusation. They carried calculation. Ma'am, he said carefully, corporate governance confirms that Level 7 clearance corresponds to active equity oversight within this aircraft's operating entity. He paused. They are requesting visual confirmation of your registry badge and secondary ID for cross-verification. There was no mention of removal. No mention of refusal to transport. The language had shifted. The woman in two nodded once. Of course. She rose not because she had been ordered, but because she chose to. The movement was controlled, unrushed. The cabin watched. She extended the badge first. The air marshal took it careful not to obscure the bodycom's line of sight. Printed clearly beneath her name, Executive Equity Oversight Tier 7 Fleet Access Authority, the air marshal exhaled quietly. He handed the badge toward the captain. Reeves read it fully this time. Every word. The blonde woman leaned into the aisle. What does that even mean? The businessman answered without looking at her. It means she's not just a passenger. The woman in 2A then produced a slim wallet from her blazer pocket. Driver's license. Corporate identification card. SEC. Filing reference number. Reeves scanned the documents against the tablet. A final verification pinged. Identity confirmed governance match validated. The amber banner disappeared. Green. The air marshal stepped back. His hand moved away from the restraint pouch entirely. Reeves looked at her again. Different now. Not suspicious. Measured. Ma'am, he said quietly, corporate governance indicates you are listed as a primary equity holder in this aircraft's parent entity. A beat. The cabin leaned forward without realizing it. The woman met his gaze steadily. Yes, she said. And you just delayed your own aircraft. The word delayed settled differently than the accusation had. It wasn't emotional. It was operational. Captain Reeves looked past her toward the open aircraft door. Ground crew still waited. The jet bridge remained attached. A delay over 5 minutes required notation. 10 minutes triggered formal reporting. They were now at 12. Corporate has verified your equity status, he said carefully. However, the security flag originated from automated conflict detection. I acted within protocol. The air marshal remained composed, but his tone had shifted from enforcement to neutrality. Documentation will reflect that the review was initiated under manifest discrepancy, he added. Documentation. The woman in 2 nodded once. Yes, she said calmly. And documentation is permanent. The cabin felt that. Permanent. Across the aisle, the businessman lowered his phone entirely now. The blonde woman stared at the badge in the captain's hand. You're telling me she owns part of this airline? The air marshal answered before Reeves could. Primary equity holder, he corrected. Silence rippled through first class. Primary. The captain swallowed slightly. Mom, he said, voice lower now. I was not notified of shareholder travel today. Dispatch did not flag executive presence. That she replied evenly is not my oversight. 21 years earlier, she had been escorted off a commuter flight in Ohio because a gate agent said your name doesn't match the boarding list format. It had. They just hadn't expected it to belong to her. She remembered the eyes. The doubt. The quiet satisfaction of someone who believed they had protected something from her. Back in the present, she looked around the cabin slowly. You didn't question my safety risk, she said evenly. You questioned my classification. The captain didn't answer. Because he couldn't. The air marshal adjusted his stance fully back to neutral. Captain, he said quietly, under corporate governance protocol, executive equity holders are permitted dual classification passenger and operational oversight. Reeves nodded once. I see that now. The tablet chimed again. Governance Advisory Bodycam recording flagged for internal compliance review. The air marshal saw it. So did she. Review. Internal compliance. The cabin understood the shift, even if they didn't know the terminology. The blonde woman sank slightly into her seat. So, what happens now? She asked. The businessman answered without hesitation. He apologizes. The captain looked at the woman in 2A. Not over her. Not through her. At her. Ma'am, he said, steady but humbled on behalf of this crew, I acknowledge that this review should have been escalated to corporate before removal was considered. There it was. Not an apology yet, but accountability beginning. She held his gaze. Before removal was considered, she repeated softly, a beat. You were one step away from deplaning a registered equity authority in front of a full cabin. The air marshal exhaled slowly. The Bodycam continued recording. The jet bridge was still attached, but the power in the cabin had already changed seats. The silence after the captain's acknowledgement was heavier than the accusation had been. The woman in 2A did not sit down immediately. She didn't need to. The cabin was already recalibrating around her. "Captain," she said evenly for transparency, "I'm going to initiate a governance protocol review of this incident." The air marshal's eyes flicked slightly. "Understood," he replied. She reached into her blazer pocket and retrieved her phone. No dramatic flourish. No raised voice. Just precision. She tapped once. "Rachel," she said, calmly, "log a Level 7 travel interference review. Include timestamp from initial security flag activation to corporate confirmation." The cabin didn't know who Rachel was. The captain did. "Executive support. Board liaison." Her voice through the phone was crisp, efficient. Already pulling flight telemetry and dispatch notes. Bodycam footage flagged in compliance queue. "Do you want full governance notification?" "Yes," she replied. "Notify the governance committee and risk oversight." The businessman across the aisle blinked. Governance committee, the blonde woman went pale. The air marshal shifted subtly. "Ma'am," he said carefully for the record, no restraints were applied. "And I appreciate that," she said without looking at him. "Document that restraint escalation was considered but not executed." The captain inhaled slowly. "Considered under protocol." "Yes," she replied. She turned toward him fully now. "Captain Reeves, did dispatch inform you that a Tier 7 equity holder was on board prior to boarding?" He hesitated. "No." "Did you request corporate verification before approaching me in the aisle?" Another pause. "No." The Bodycam blinked red, recording every answer. She nodded once. "Thank you." Rachel's voice returned through the speaker. "Governance is requesting confirmation. Do you want this classified as operational bias review or procedural deviation?" The cabin heard that. "Bias. Deviation." The words were no longer whispered. They were institutional. She didn't hesitate. Procedural deviation pending bias analysis. The captain's shoulders lowered just slightly. The air marshal remained steady but no longer defensive. The jet bridge operator outside glanced toward the cockpit waiting for departure clearance. Inside, the power structure had already changed. The woman in 2 lowered the phone. "This aircraft," she said evenly, "is partially governed by my equity. Operational safety decisions should never be influenced by profile assumption." The blonde woman stared down at her lap. The businessman spoke softly, almost to himself. She wasn't flagged because she was dangerous. No one contradicted him. She looked at the captain one final time in that moment. "You saw a mismatch," she said calmly. "You didn't see authority." The air marshal's Bodycam captured the stillness that followed. And for the first time, the captain didn't stand taller than her. He stood accountable. The cabin had gone from tense to attentive. Now it was waiting. Captain Reeves cleared his throat. "Ma'am, corporate governance has requested acknowledgement of your presence on board today. They've updated dispatch logs accordingly." "Updated?" "Not corrected." "Updated?" The woman in 2A held his gaze. "That update," she said calmly, "should have preceded confrontation." The air marshal gave a subtle nod. Procedurally, she was right. Rachel's voice returned through the phone speaker. "Governance confirms you are listed as a primary equity stakeholder with operational oversight rights across Fleet Division A. They're asking if you want an executive notation added to the captain's file." The blonde woman's head snapped up. "Executive notation," the businessman exhaled slowly. "This just escalated," he murmured. The captain stiffened. "That won't be necessary," he said carefully. "We followed security protocol based on the information provided." The woman in 2 studied him. Then she did something subtle. She stepped one pace forward into the aisle, not in defiance, but in ownership. "I am not just a passenger on this aircraft," she said clearly. No raised voice. No theatrics. Just fact. "I sit on the governance oversight board that authorizes its operating budget." Silence. Even the hum of the ventilation felt distant. The air marshal blinked once. The businessman leaned back slowly. The blonde woman said nothing. The captain absorbed it. Governance Oversight Board. Not shareholder. Not investor. Board. She continued. "When you approached me with removal language before verification, you weren't just addressing a manifest discrepancy. A beat. You were challenging the authority that funds your cockpit." The words didn't explode. They landed. Heavy. Measured. Unavoidable. The air marshal's bodycam captured the stillness that followed. Captain Reeves lowered his tablet. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "now had I been informed of your governance role prior to boarding, this interaction would have unfolded differently." She met his eyes without blinking. That, she replied, is precisely the issue. The businessman across the aisle finally spoke aloud. She shouldn't need prior announcement to be treated correctly. No one disagreed. The blonde woman folded into her seat completely. For the first time since boarding, the power in the cabin was visible, and it wasn't wearing stripes. The shift wasn't emotional. It was structural. Captain Reeves' tablet vibrated again. Not a notification. A directive. Corporate Governance Immediate Action Advisory. The air marshal saw the banner change color before the captain spoke. Blue. Compliance. Priority. "Captain," the marshal said quietly, "you may want to read that aloud." Reeves hesitated. Then he did. "Effective immediately, this incident is under formal governance review. Command authority remains intact for flight safety, but executive travel interference procedures are being audited." The words were precise. Legal. Unavoidable. The cabin absorbed every syllable. The woman in 2A didn't move. She didn't need to. Rachel's voice returned through the phone. "Governance has frozen escalation authority on this matter. No removal action may proceed without board clearance." Frozen. The air marshal stepped fully back now. His posture relaxed. Restraint pouch untouched. The blonde woman whispered almost to herself. "Oh my God," the businessman exhaled sharply. "So he can't remove her?" The air marshal answered evenly. "Not without corporate override." Captain Reeves read the next line silently. His jaw tightened. The woman in 2A watched him. "What does it say?" she asked calmly. He looked up. "Governance is requesting post-flight written explanation regarding escalation language used prior to identity verification." Escalation language. The cabin knew what that meant. Removal. Detainment. Implied threat. The air marshal's bodycam continued recording. Documentation was no longer optional. It was mandated. Reeves lowered the tablet. "For clarity," he said, "measured now, you will not be deplaned. The flight will proceed once dispatch updates are finalized. Not permission. Acknowledgement." The woman in 2A inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." But there was no triumph in her tone. Only record. Outside, the jet bridge began retracting. Ground crew stepped back. Engines powered slightly higher. Inside the cabin, something else had powered down. Assumption. The businessman leaned toward the aisle. "This is going to end someone's career," he murmured. The air marshal didn't respond. He didn't need to. The captain returned toward the cockpit slowly. Not defeated, but recalibrated. And for the first time since boarding, he walked past her without leaving the room. She was already ahead of it. The engines began their slow, steady build toward departure. Inside the cockpit, checklists resumed. But in first class, no one had moved on. Captain Reeves stepped back into the aisle one final time before sealing the door. His posture was formal now, measured. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "the flight is cleared for departure. On behalf of this crew, I acknowledge that escalation occurred prior to complete verification. That will be reviewed. Not dramatic. Not defensive. Accountable." The woman in two remained standing. She studied him for a moment. Then she spoke, not just to him, but to the room. "You acted within what you believed was protocol," she said calmly. A pause. But protocol without perspective becomes profiling. The cabin stilled again. The businessman nodded slowly. The blonde woman looked down at her folded hands. She continued, "You didn't question my safety risk. A beat. You questioned my presence." The words landed heavier than any accusation earlier. The air marshal's bodycam blinked steadily, recording not tension but truth. "I should not need pre-announcement prior notice or visible credentials beyond what any passenger carries," she said evenly. "Equity does not change dignity. It only exposes how it was measured." No one interrupted. Not the captain. Not the marshal. Not the cabin. She adjusted her blazer cuff and finally returned to her seat. "Respect," she added softly, "is not upgraded with clearance level." The captain absorbed that. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly. This time, not as authority, but as acknowledgement. The cabin door sealed. The jet bridge retracted fully. As the aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate, something unspoken had shifted. The blonde woman finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean," the woman in two looked at her. "I know," she said calmly. And that was worse. The engines roared stronger now. "Taxi clearance granted." The air marshal powered down active review mode on the bodycom. The red blink stopped. Documentation complete. The businessman leaned back into his seat. "She didn't raise her voice," he murmured. "No, she hadn't." As the aircraft turned toward the runway, sunlight caught the badge resting against her blazer once more. Executive Equity Oversight Tier 7. It meant governance, authority, ownership. But none of that was what changed the cabin. What changed it was that she never needed to shout to prove she belonged. And as the wheels left the ground, the standard had already been raised. At 30,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed. First class returned to its polished calm linen napkins, quiet service muted conversations. But something fundamental had shifted. Captain Reeves remained in the cockpit longer than usual after initial climb. His voice over the intercom was steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience earlier. We appreciate your cooperation during a required security review. We are now en route to Washington. No details. No names. But everyone knew." In 2A, she reviewed her tablet calmly. An encrypted email notification appeared. Governance Committee Preliminary Review. Opened Rachel's message followed. Initial compliance assessment suggests procedural overreach. Risk Oversight wants full transcript and bodycam archive. "Do you want independent counsel looped in?" She typed back one line. "Not yet. Monitor only." Across the aisle, the businessman leaned toward her slightly. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I just want to say that was handled with remarkable restraint." She offered a small nod. "Restraint keeps things accurate," she replied. Behind them, the blonde woman sat unusually still. Her earlier certainty had dissolved somewhere between amber and green. She finally leaned forward. "I shouldn't have said what I did," she admitted quietly. "I assumed." The woman in two looked at her, not with anger, with clarity. "Assumption is comfortable," she said evenly, "until it's documented." A beat. Today, it was. Up front in the cockpit, another secure message appeared on the captain's display. "Governance Directive Post-Flight Debrief Mandatory. Executive Travel Sensitivity Training Review Pending." Reeves read it in silence. This wouldn't end at landing. Back in 2A, she looked out the window as the clouds parted beneath the wing. Ownership wasn't about control. It was about responsibility. And earlier that morning she had chosen to fly without advance notice, not to test the crew, but to observe the system. Now she had her answer. The aircraft continued smoothly toward its destination. Engines steady. Course corrected. And somewhere between departure and arrival standards had quietly been rewritten. The aircraft door opened with a soft, hydraulic sigh. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just procedure. But no one stood immediately. Passengers who normally rushed for overhead bins remained seated as if instinct told them something else was still unfolding. Captain Reeves stepped out of the cockpit. His uniform was the same. The stripes still gleamed, but authority no longer radiated from posture. It radiated from scrutiny. His secured device vibrated once. He didn't need to read it. He already knew. Governance compliance temporary command review activated return leg reassignment confirmed not suspension. Not termination. Review. But an aviation review is gravity. It pulls. The Air Marshal remained positioned near the forward galley, no longer monitoring her but the room. The Bodycam unit had powered down after landing. Recording complete. Documentation sealed. In 2A, she gathered her tablet and slid it into a slim leather portfolio. No rush. No celebration. Rachel's message appeared again. Risk oversight wants clarification. Are you recommending disciplinary action or procedural reform? She read it once. Then typed reform. A pause. Then added mandatory executive clearance education for flight command. Send. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward. I just checked the airline app, he said quietly. Return crew changed. The blonde woman looked up sharply. So it's official. The woman in 2A stood slowly. Consequences are procedural, she said evenly, not personal. She stepped into the aisle. The air marshal instinctively moved aside, not commanded. Respectfully, Captain Reeves approached from the cockpit corridor. There was no hostility in his expression, only understanding. Ma'am, he said evenly, I've been notified of post-flight review. I want to state there was no malice intended. She met his eyes. I believe that she replied, a beat. But intent is not the only metric that matters. The businessman behind them murmured, that's true. The blonde woman lowered her gaze. Reeves inhaled slowly. I've commanded aircraft for 27 years, he said. I've relied on systems to protect this flight. And today, she answered calmly, the system relied on assumption. Silence. Not sharp. Reflective. He nodded once. Yes, ma'am. The jet bridge door fully connected. Passengers began exiting in measured quiet. No applause. No whispers now. Just awareness. She stepped toward the exit, then paused, turned slightly. Captain, she said evenly. He looked up. When authority moves faster than verification, it stops being leadership. He absorbed it. She continued. Leadership waits for facts. A final pause. I hope your review reflects that. He gave a short nod. It will. She walked through the jet bridge without looking back. Behind her, cabin crew reset trays. The cockpit lights dimmed. The aircraft that had left the gate under suspicion now sat at the terminal under examination. Not of her. Of the process. And as she stepped into the terminal badge resting calmly against her blazer, the lesson was no longer about clearance level. It was about standard. And standards, once raised publicly, don't lower quietly again. The terminal was loud. Rolling suitcases. Gate announcements. People rushing to meetings they believed mattered. She walked through it all without urgency. No escort. No headlines. No one in the corridor knew what had just shifted 30,000 feet above them, but someone did. Her phone vibrated once more. Governance Committee emergency session convened. She didn't slow down. Rachel's voice came through in a secure call. Board members are asking whether you want this incident circulated internally as a case study.
She paused near a wide window overlooking the runway.
Aircraft lined up for departure. Metal wings cutting through afternoon light. Yes, she said calmly. Circulate it. A beat. Remove names. Keep the facts. Behind the glass, another plane lifted off. Order restored. But not unchanged. Rachel continued. Risk Oversight is recommending a formal addition to the Executive Travel Sensitivity Protocol, clarifying that equity holders are not required to pre-notify Flight Command unless they choose to. She nodded once. Add one more line. Silence on the other end. What line? She looked down at the badge resting against her blazer. Executive Equity Oversight Tier 7. Then, she said it. Authority must never outpace verification. Rachel didn't respond immediately. Then that'll be adopted. The call ended. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, far from the gate, far from the cabin, the incident was already being rewritten into policy language. Not scandal. Not drama. Procedure. A memo drafted effective immediately. Security flag escalations involving executive registry access require corporate verification prior to passenger confrontation. Another line added beneath it, removal language prohibited until identity confirmation is complete. Somewhere a training module was being edited. Somewhere else a captain would soon review new guidance. Not because she shouted, not because she embarrassed anyone, but because documentation doesn't argue. It records. A news alert buzzed briefly across financial feeds. Major airline updates. Executive clearance protocol after internal review. No names. No viral clips. Just compliance. She resumed walking toward the exit. Outside, a car waited, not flashy, not ceremonial. As she approached, her phone vibrated again. A message, this time from an unfamiliar number. The businessman from 3C. Thank you. My daughter flies alone for college. I hope she meets leaders like you. She read it once, then replied, teacher to ask for grounds. Send. She entered the car. The door closed softly. Across town, Captain Reeves sat in a quiet compliance office reviewing the incident timeline. Not defensive. Reflective. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the registry mismatch, but the speed of his assumption. And for the first time in years, he understood something uncomfortable. Experience does not eliminate bias. It just makes it quieter. Back in the moving car, she looked out at the passing skyline. Ownership was never about power. It was about responsibility. And today, responsibility had meant restraint. She could have requested immediate disciplinary action. She didn't. She could have made the incident public. She didn't. Because this was never about humiliation. It was about standard. The car turned toward the city center. Sunlight reflected off glass towers. Her badge caught the light one last time before she removed it and placed it carefully into her portfolio. Not because she needed it, but because she didn't. And somewhere in a training manual being revised at that exact moment, a new sentence was added: verification precedes escalation. The aircraft that carried her that afternoon would fly again tomorrow. Different passengers, different crew, but a slightly different protocol, a slightly slower trigger, a slightly higher threshold. And sometimes that is how systems change. Not through noise. Not through outrage, but through a single moment where authority was asked to wait. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard, and the standard stayed.